Welcome back, Dr. Renee. This is episode 4. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Welcome, Dr. Olysha. I'm excited as well.
We've had some really interesting topics over the last few episodes, and it seems like they're pretty well received. I've been enjoying our listeners on social media.
Yes. Very excited about the feedback. Anyone, make sure that you follow us on social media, but also leave your reviews so that we can also tag you and follow you on social media.
So, Dr. Renee, I'm a big fan of podcasts, and so I have a few that I follow, and I cannot tell you how exciting it is for me when I open my Apple Music podcast app and I see ours pop up at the top. New episode.
Oh, good. I know. I think it's so cool. I am going to put out a post, but we have like 178 listens, and that's only been for week 1, 2, and 3. And these are original, or what they say, unique listeners. So that means 178, unique listeners were listening. And I'm so happy because that's only been 3 weeks of us having a podcast. So yay us.
Really exciting, and kudos to you for doing the social media for everyone listening.
Thank you.
Dr. Renee is the social media guru, so she's
making sure I control the message, brand integrity.
Okay, well, Dr. Renee, today we are going to talk about critical race theory, as we have promised our listeners.
Yes.
This, when we were brainstorming topics, we were both like, yeah, we have to talk about this.
Right.
Because it's become a real hot topic, and it's an unusual thing to follow because typically things like this exist really inside academia. And so now we're seeing it like being fought about, in the news and in school board meetings and all sorts of stuff. So it's an interesting thing to watch something in our, just coming alive and sparking anger and being used as a political tool. So
right. Which is the whole psychology sometimes of politics. It becomes emotional, which is what can cause people to act or to just stand by. So that's one reason why it's become such an emotional hot button.
And often without really any understanding of what it is that one is reacting to. So that is why we are here.
That's correct. Hashtag be informed.
And, I've talked to a lot of my friends who they're smart people, but they're like, what is critical race theory? I don't even know, break it down. Like, I don't even know what this is. So that's what we're hoping to do here today. And at first, I'm just going to explain theory in general. So why we explore different theories and other common theories that listeners may be familiar with, and then also just some of the benefits to theorizing. So the easiest way to explain theory is that theory is used to explain things. So did your mind do a little somersault there? The Oxford Dictionary defines theory as a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. So if you hear that definition, it's a lot of explaining.
Right.
And then
I guess a concept to explain another concept.
Right. And so theories can be applied in different areas. So like in the natural sciences, theories are used to explain nature using the scientific method, which I'm sure most of us heard about, remember from the 6th grade. And according to the Field Science Museum, a theory is a carefully thought out explanation for observations of the natural world that has been constructed using the scientific method, which brings together many facts and hypotheses. So when we think of another hot topic theory, or at least it used to be, back in the day, theory of evolution. I mean, I guess still some people think this is a hot topic, but the people that are against the theory of evolution, typically called creationists, they poo-poo it because it's a theory. So they say there's nothing substantial to it. It's just something people made up. But in fact, there's a ton of evidence to support evolution that has been observed over time. There's a whole collection of it in science. So the theory is used to explain it, and then it uses the scientific method to bring together those facts and hypotheses to explain a phenomenon. And then, so I wanted to talk about the sciences because many of our listeners are probably familiar with the scientific method. But then, there are fields like ours, psychology and education, where it's more about a way to explain human behavior and also predict human behavior. So this is important. Obviously, psychologically, you've talked about this a lot in our episodes. In education, we actually use it quite a bit as well. I'm an instructional designer and before an instructional designer teacher. And so, these are things that we have to learn about in order to understand how people learn best, because that is human behavior. So some of us might be familiar with B.F. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning. I know that you are, Dr. Renee.
Definitely.
But to remind or inform listeners, this is the idea where I think the most common way to explain it is like you give a dog a treat when they've done something positive. So like, sit, Swissy, that's my dog. And then when he sits, I give him a treat. So he's done a positive, he's followed the command, he's done a positive behavior, he's given a reward. And then this is repeated. So every time I tell Swissy to sit, he sits, he gets a treat. And eventually he's conditioned to sit on command because he knows he's going to get his treat. Whether or not I give him a treat after 20 times of doing this, it doesn't matter. He's in his brain, he's been conditioned to know to sit, and he's hoping he will get his reward. So in education, we use this to predict student behaviors. And there's even a whole theory around that called behaviorism. And Dr. Renee, psychologists can use this to help clients build healthy habits, like quitting smoking. And, you can replace that habit by doing something healthier in theory, like taking a walk. Although I don't know many smokers who prefer taking a walk over smoking, but that's the idea. And so a lot of people don't even know that some of these, and there's a lot of popular products or books or whatever that are using these concepts to actually inform people on how, there's tons of books on habits and how to build healthier habits. And teachers are using all sorts of books and tools, and a lot of those are all built around these educational psychology and psychology theories. And the operant conditioning is something that, like I just said, is used widely for many things in our daily lives. And it's all based on that theory that originated by B.F. Skinner in the 1940s. So I think it's important for us to remind listeners that these theories that we're talking about, they're not bad, they're not scary, they're not fake. It's not made up by a bunch of, intellectuals sitting in a room together, just, talking shit about things.
Just making stuff up.
Yeah. Theory is an attempt by scientists, scholars, and educators to explain the world and the people in our world, and they are using the science and facts to do this. So that was my crash course in theory. Now I was wondering if you wouldn't mind explaining to our listeners about critical race theory specifically.
Okay. Yes, definitely. So again, critical race theory. So theory is an attempt to explain a concept, to be able to predict or understand behavior. And you can apply it to animals or to humans. And so when we have the term critical race theory, then we're focusing on applying a theory to race and understanding any part of that. So when we look at the main news and the fuss about what is critical theory, the one reason why it's been such a hot topic is because there's a lot of misinformation or lack of information. And because of that, it's causing many people to find it difficult to acknowledge or to want to acknowledge our country's racist history and how it impacts the present. So because it has race in there and it has a critical, and then people are using it, as you said, as a political tool to just polarize individuals or to cause them to react from fear, then what they're really trying to play on is people not wanting to know for themselves what the truth is. So I mentioned, I think it was 2 weeks ago about cognitive dissonance. So
Yes.
cognitive dissonance, and I gave an example, I think last week also about applying it to race. So cognitive dissonance, if I'm a person of one particular race, and I'll use a non-Black, I'll use a white race. So if I was a white person and I benefited historically just because of my skin color, then I may not be a blatant racist, but I may enjoy the benefits of being able to be a white person only, and for that having many advantages for me. Mm-hmm. So if I'm hearing about the bad of critical race theory, and I know that I'm not a racist, I may not want to have my children hearing about it because I'm thinking, okay, what's going to talk about how bad, white people are. And so cognitive dissonance is, I don't want to hear about what anyone is saying about CRT or critical race theory because it makes me uncomfortable. And so in explaining what critical race theory is, we'll get to explaining it in a way that people will not be threatened or intimidated, but also not being allowed to remain ignorant for not knowing it. And then people using your fear or not wanting to learn to then stay in the dark.
For those that may not have heard about it before, hopefully after we go through this episode and explain it, you can also start, when you hear it on the news, or like your grandma's telling you something they heard from Fox News or whatever, that you can then say, well,
like actually,
yeah, well,
right.
Actually.
Explaining what the truth is. So let me say what it's not, because this is what's been in the media, explaining CRT in a way that it's actually not. So what CRT, which we'll use for critical race theory is not the narratives about gross exaggerations of the actual theory that we have for CRT. CRT, regardless of what you're hearing, it does not attribute racism to white people as individuals or as an entire group. So there is no global attack on non-whites, and it's also not just for Black people. What happened is that with CRT, it was influenced, it has influenced scholarship in fields outside of the confines of legal studies. So it also includes women's studies, education, American studies, and sociology. And so it's not just for Black people and not just for Black people in America. Now we are also having it for Asian Americans, Latinas, Muslim, and also Native Americans. So again, it's not a global attack on white persons, nor is a get out of jail free card. I guess that's not really a good example of talking about Black people.
Yeah, watch yourself there, Dr. Reneé.
Yeah, I know. Nor is it a victimization approach to understanding the plight of Black Americans. So this is what CRT is. CRT recognizes that racism is not a bygone relic of the past. So this is not something that happened in the 1900s or the 1700s or when Blacks were brought over from Africa. It instead acknowledges the legacy of slavery, then the perpetuation of segregation and the imposition of a second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color. And so what they're recognizing is that we're not saying it did not happen, or we're not saying that all Black people were slaves or that all white people were slave owners. What we are simply recognizing is that this indeed happened. And because it happened, and because it was systemically happening to a specific racial group of people, then it's now permeated the social fabric of our nation. So it's an acknowledgement that racism is a normal feature of society and is embedded within America's systems and institutions. And so some people feel like when you hear institutional racism, you're talking about like a building, but institution is more like a construct. It's like how we are all getting along or how we all understand or operate. For example, the legal system or the public school system or our voting system. So it's more of a conglomerate of systems and operations, even though they may say institution. CRT actually came from the legal profession, and it wasn't focusing on racial disparities, as a solution. It was more so a response to observing the widespread inequalities in the legal system of how Black persons and non-white persons were being treated in an unfair and in a gross disparity and inequality of getting harsher sentences and having less fair treatment from judges in their rulings and in sentencing. So the legal scholars were looking at, okay, well, what is actually happening here? We're seeing it, now let's analyze it. So this is how CRT was born, and it grew into an intellectual and social movement. And it also created like the framework for understanding legal systems and legal analysis. So a lot of people are thinking like, oh, this is brought out of like the suffrage movement or a civil rights. No, it really started out as a legal issue because of the racism and the systems of inequality recognized in the Black population.
Which, as we have pointed out in a couple of other episodes, still exist. I mean, it's not like this has gone away. This is still being studied and still very much happening in many places across the country.
Right. Some of the core principles of CRT, one is that race is not a natural, biologically grounded feature of distinct subgroups of human beings, meaning that they were saying that race, so example, you being a Caucasian person and me being of mostly African-American descent, they wouldn't say it as this is like a biological thing that happened. They're saying it's more of a social construct, meaning that it's what we invented in our society or in our cultures. So it's a cultural invention of a category that has been used to oppress and exploit people of color, but they use the physical characteristics of different groups of persons to use that as the determining factor of who will be oppressed and who will be exploited. Racism is inherent in the law and legal institutions of the US. And so again, as one of the core principles of CRT, what we're recognizing in CRT as a principle is that the racism as a function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. Critical race theorists are mostly focused on applying their understanding of the institutional, the social, or the structural nature of racism, and they're trying to understand it not as a way to make, non-whites feel victimized or to make white persons feel guilty, but instead as a way to help eliminate all race-based and other acts of injustice in systems and practices that are inequitable.
No, that was a wonderful, wonderful explanation of it. What I thought we could do maybe after hearing about what it is and what it isn't, and then also like why people study theory. Now I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit about how it's being used politically. And this is where the fuss comes in. Do you feel ready to talk about
that? Yeah, definitely. I do want to say, like, as you mentioned, like it's more of it started out as an academic, legal system, legal scholarly studies, but it's what it is not a diversity and inclusion training as it's being promoted in some of the media, nor is it just a system to brainwash children.
Right. And that's a really good point, because there is a lot of attack also on diversity and inclusion initiatives, within institutions like you had said. So yeah. Sure.
Let me just back up for 1 second before we continue. I mentioned about systems and systemic theory. So let me just define what a system is. I mentioned like the public school system or the legal system. But a system, according to Oxford Dictionary, is a set of things that work together as parts of an interconnecting network, or a set of principles or procedures according to how something is done. So when you look at the systemic racism in America, what we can see is that in the criminal justice system, in the education system, in the labor market and the housing market and healthcare systems, CRT is recognizing that there is a gross, obvious historical account of how there are disparities that are specifically being able to use to predict who will get resources and who will not get resources.
And actually, that goes back to our talk about the census in episode 2, and how even there are some disparities, and that actually allocates resources and so on. So you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of
Mm-hmm.
these things are interconnected, and
Right.
where it's like so many different layers of
Right.
inequality in different places. And it is important for us to identify those, and for us as a society, right? Like, uh,
Right.
it isn't even about, so that's, and we can talk about this a little bit later in the psychology part, but it's not even about like me as a white person feeling offended that somebody might think I'm racist, because it's not
Right.
about me.
It's
It's
not about
about
that. Right.
it's about the people in my community who may or may not be getting the resources they need to have a healthy, happy existence, which is their right as a human, right? So
Right. Right. And it's all because those disparities are based mainly just on the person's race.
right, yeah. So yeah, the what we're seeing, and to me it's just mind-boggling, but it really shouldn't be, but that this is being used as a political tactic to cause
Mm-hmm.
fear in people. There are a lot of politicians and loud voices who want people to believe that CRT is evil, is polluting children's minds, etc., like you
Right.
were talking about.
Right.
So, and hopefully after your explanation, we can see that this is very specialized, and it's also centered around our collective history of race and slavery and inequality in this country. And that does make a good starting point to scare people, because again,
Right.
I feel like a lot of white people get very like automatically defensive when
Mm-hmm.
talking
Mm-hmm.
about racism.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to get into that in a bit, but I did want to mention some specific things that are happening out in our world, and about how people are using this as scare tactics. So
Okay.
as of November of last year, there have been a lot of widespread efforts to ban CRT from classrooms. And so, just as an example, there are 9 states, that's Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Arizona, and North Dakota, that have all actually passed legislation. Now, Arizona's was overturned by the Arizona Supreme Court, and that was also in November of last year.
Mm-hmm.
And then the state school boards, and Dr. Renee,
Old faithful
Florida,
Florida.
Florida, 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 and again Georgia. Man, they
Mm-hmm.
are these states. Utah and Alabama have introduced new guidelines barring CRT related discussions, and
Mm-hmm.
also, so we can say that, that's at the state level, but then there are some local school boards in Georgia, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia who are also criticizing the use of CRT. Um, and, you know, that can happen, like I said, at the state level, local level,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and it is happening. Also in Virginia, the new Republican governor and his campaign promises said that he would abolish critical race theory on day one in office. I
Mm-hmm.
hate to mention my state again, but our governor Ron DeSantis said he wanted to make sure that people are not supporting critical race theory. And then in Arizona, another politician repeatedly slammed critical race theory as anti-white racism. So,
Right, right.
so as you can see, it's spreading around like wildfire.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
But it's spreading because it's based off of lies, and that's what happens when you have fear. You're using fear to provoke action rather than honest information.
and it's not even just, the thing that gets me is it's not even just a lie, it's a lie by design. Like
Mm-hmm.
there
Mm-hmm.
were strategists, Republican strategists, who thought, hey, this is a great uh, a hot topic that we can use to make people
Mm-hmm.
angry so that they don't
Right,
vote for Democrats, and that they, or whatever.
right.
So we're in our resources this week. I found a map that shows the different states that have different things happening. So we'll include that if you want to look at that on your own. One case in particular that just happened very recently is in Mississippi. And like in other southern states, there's a majority Republican, conservative Republicans in their legislature. And recently, the Black members of Mississippi's Senate walked out of the chamber to protest a vote on a bill described as prohibition on critical race theory. And specifically, this bill forbids public schools in the state from, I'm going to read this directly.
Okay.
Forcing students to agree that any sex, race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin is inherently superior or inferior. So did you get that? Because they're forbidding schools to force students to agree with this statement. It's wacky.
Right.
It doesn't even mention or define critical race theory.
Right. So it's very loosey-goosey.
But that's by design, because it's to say, you know, we are preventing our kids from being, you know, polluted, their minds being polluted with this, what did that other person say, anti-white racism propaganda or whatever. Right. Well, that legislation, an empty piece of legislation, passed 32-2 with the two white Democrats voting against it. As I said, the Black members of the Senate walked out. So I just thought I'd mention that because that just happened. So it's happening everywhere.
Yeah, unfortunately. But one reason why it's happening is because the people who are electing these persons are not understanding what it actually means. And therefore, they're just going along with whatever their representative is saying and doing. And those elected officials are counting on people not knowing and being too lazy to not want to know. So again, that's our whole, reason for the podcast, to provoke people to want to know, to be informed, and to take action.
Yeah, they can't hide under the rug anymore, right?
Right. Hopefully not.
So that's about all I wanted to cover, because it's happening in so many different places that it would be difficult to say specific things everywhere.
Right.
So I think what makes sense now is to just kind of talk through again some of the reasons why this is being used, why it angers people. And I think this does come back to the concept of systematic oppression and racism.
Right.
I'm passing the ball over to you.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So again, if we look at the real reason and the real purpose of trying to understand critical race theory, the whole reasoning and the birth of it is to try to help understand how there are so many systems in our country, such as the rules, laws, and procedures that predictably and consistently lead to different outcomes based solely on race. And the reasoning for wanting to recognize it is because if you can't see something, if you can't acknowledge something, then you also can't solve it and prevent the problem. And so the way that these systemic differences show up is that you have racial disparities in police killings. Recently, we can see it in COVID-19 and other healthcare disparities, the devaluing of homes in Black neighborhoods. So scholars were looking at it from an actual legal understanding of the law and how to make fair judicial proceedings and rulings. And this is where it came from. But then that opened a big can of worms to then say, wait a minute, this is happening in almost everywhere, which allowed people such as Black people who were experiencing racism and discrimination on a daily basis, who were already accepting this as a way of life. We call this like the Black psychology in America, meaning that Black people already have the expectation for being oppressed and unjustly discriminated against or oppressed. And so with that, then we already are kind of like expecting that. But for non-Blacks, for non-brown people, this whole idea of looking at it from a legal standpoint to just understanding how can we improve our law opened up the reality like, well, wait a minute, our law at its core is faulty. And we can see that our law is systematically being used negatively against a particular group of people, and those just happen to be African Americans and Hispanics. So just a few examples of how these systems of disparity exist even until today. So African Americans and Hispanic Americans are on average more likely than similarly qualified white persons to be denied loans or jobs. They tend to pay more than whites for a broad range of products and services, such as cars.
Mhm.
They are more likely than whites to be unjustly suspected of criminal behavior by police or private/white citizens. They are more likely than whites to be victims of police brutality, including the unjustified case of lethal force. And this is what happened of how the whole Black Lives Matter was birthed. So I don't know
Mhm.
if you remember George Zimmerman and Trayvon
Mhm.
Martin. So
I
this is
do.
where it happened because it was a regular citizen who saw this little Black boy in a hoodie who was minding his own business. But because that citizen saw this Black boy as, quote, looking suspicious, he took it upon himself to exert lethal action against him and resulted
Mhm.
not only in him killing the boy, but him legally being protected and acquitted of that murder.
Yeah, and I do recall Congresswoman Lucy McBath also had a
Mm-hmm.
son who was murdered, of course, in Florida. And
Right.
her son was a teenager and he was just hanging out playing music in a gas station. And
That's right.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so
And so, as you can see, just regular citizens are being allowed to just kill Black and brown people and with no consequence. We also have the recent example, which was the launch of our podcast of the January 6th insurrection. And do you see
mhm,
how police were walking and escorting the white
right.
persons from the Capitol? But had it been a Black person, then there would have been firearms, gas, and
Correct.
everything, thrown to try to control it. So this is just like a
Mhm.
very vivid and recent example of how we have systems that allow Black people to be disproportionately negatively treated or killed. And in the actual conviction of a crime, then we find that people of color, especially African Americans, are usually imprisoned more often and for longer periods than white persons who were also found guilty of the same offenses.
Mhm.
So, this is how it all became about, as far as like the legal reasonings of looking at sentencings and looking at judge rulings. We also can see different disparities systemically in Black and brown or Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, where these neighborhoods receive fewer and more inferior public services. And that usually includes public education, school
Mhm.
budgets. So if you don't have a lot of money to pay teachers or a lot of money to buy books, that means that your students are not being taught at a quality, allowing them to be able to overcome any poverty that they might have had at their own hands. So instead, it creates a cycle where poor people, especially Black poor people, are staying poor and are staying oppressed because they're not able to get out because they're systemically being forced to not be able to succeed. And so this is just like a very, obvious cycle that we can see in how people are being systemically, meaning as the system, starting with education. So imagine if you have one particular zip code, like in Baltimore, it might be 21218. So if
Mhm.
every child in zip code 21218, if they are more likely to have high school dropouts or not being able to go to school, that then creates where they have people who are then getting on social services because then they can't get a job because then the grades are low. They can't get a job. They therefore can't support their families. And then they stay inside a community and can never get out. And all of this goes down to the trickle down of they were originally forbidden and obstructed from receiving an honest, equitable, high quality education that
Mhm.
someone in a different zip code, this other little person would be able to get just by living in a different zip code. And those different zip codes are, as we talked about gerrymandering, finagled and the lines are redrawn just so that they can keep all the resources and keep all the good schools or the good grocery stores or the good healthcare in very strategic areas on
Mhm.
purpose to deliberately leave out the others.
Mm-hmm. And also keep certain groups of people, like we talked about, from
Mm-hmm.
voting
That's
in
correct.
a way
Mm-hmm.
that actually can make a change.
Right, right. Let me just as a little primer. Racism is the belief that one race is superior to another or to other races. And so when you have critical race theory, racism is the belief that, well, of course, my children, because of my race, we deserve this, but your race is genetically inferior, biologically inferior, or psychologically inferior. So therefore, there's no need to give you resources because you couldn't handle them anyway. So racism is the blatant obstruction or the blatant oppression of another race simply because of the belief that one race is superior to another person's race in that person's mind.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you look at America and how America, enjoys this prestige of being the great country in the world, then we can look at the only time America really tries to improve their image is when there's, obvious instances where other countries would be appalled of being associated with America and not want to do business with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so because the anti-Black racism in the United States has drawn a lot of attention since the 2010 murder of Trayvon Martin, that was when more people began to openly talk about critical race theory and understanding how this happened, and where money and political leaders were willing to even have the courage to address it. So it wasn't where they really cared about Black people. It wasn't where they really cared about systemic oppression, but it was more because our state is getting a bad rep. Our country is getting a bad reputation, and we don't want to lose that. So because of that, let's go ahead and look at this, entertain it, but still keep it contained.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's one of the reasons. I want to talk about the psychology of supporters versus non-supporters of the critical race theory. Are you ready for that, Dr. Olysha, or do you have any questions so far?
No, yeah, I'm ready for it.
Okay. So, many Americans are not able to separate their individual identity as an American from their social institution. So, example, if I see myself, well, because I am a Black person, or if I see myself as a Democrat, then I'm seeing myself as belonging to this whole group of people rather than me just being Renee. And so, because people, for whatever reason in America, have a higher likelihood of seeing themselves as part of a group, then whenever you talk about CRT or not promoting the truth about slavery, then a non-Black person or a group of white persons may feel unjustly attacked because they don't see themselves as being separate from the history of America. They see it as a collective attack on their race and on their personhood, especially if you're a white male. They may feel as if being a white male is making them a target for more of an attack. So the reasons why they're not able to accept it as being a separate entity or something outside of themselves as individual, that leads them to believe that everyone is calling them racist and they take it personally. And they believe that now you're saying I'm a racist and therefore I'm going to resist it because I'm not. And so again, because of not knowing what CRT truly is, they are being misinformed and then mistakenly believing that people are attacking them just because of their race when they really are not. So in a sense, that's kind of like the part of the theory of we're being attacked, or we're being attacked and having racism against us as white persons, because now they're saying that we're all bad, but that's not the truth. CRT is only exposing what has already happened and the impact from 300 years ago and how that's manifesting today in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we look at the neurolinguistics, so that's how, neurologically using words and psychology and how that impacts what people are thinking. So I'm not really a big sports fan, but most of the time people will say, unless it's like the finale, like the Super Bowl commercials, and I get to have my nachos and stuff, but not like actually in love with the sport. But usually what happens when you're using the psychology of language, then people will use words that make them feel psychologically comfortable with who they are and with what they are and the different roles they believe that they have in life. So for example, if you have a sports team and they lose, most people will say, oh man, they lost. But if they win, they'll say, oh, we won. So because they don't want to have the association and the subsequent psychological discomfort of being with a losing team. So it's always they lost or we won. And that's just the psychology of language. Similarly to prunes. So everyone usually thinks about prunes as, helping with constipation, maybe excessive diarrhea if you drink too much prune juice. So a great marketing technique is using the psychology of seeing what that word is in your mind, associating with the belief of constipation, and then you're thinking, like, ooh, I don't want to have prunes. So then what they did was change it to, oh no, these are not prunes. These are dried plums. And it's like, oh, I like plums. Plums are juicy. They're sweet. And it's still the same thing. But they're using the psychology of language to persuade people to think or to act in a way of how they want them to act or think. This is what they do for consumers, for your clients, and for voters. And this is what they're also doing for critical race theory.
I just have to say about prunes in our house, they're loved. They're beloved.
Oh, really? Well, I guess you must be regular.
We won't talk about that on our podcast, Dr.
Right. Okay. But yeah, so it's just the use of language to make someone think or feel something. So if you have people who are non-supporters of CRT, the psychological profile for them is that they are being the victims of fear to promote that all white persons are oppressors and all white people are racist. And so by using racist and attaching that to critical race theory, in every conversation or in every press soundbite, you are then psychologically conditioning them to think and to be uncomfortable with CRT and not wanting to hear anything about it because it makes you feel so uncomfortable or so guilty that you just shut down. So, that's one way. And it's also people, the psychological profile of non-supporters is that they are usually unwilling to be able to address the past or unwilling to address that something bad did happen that I'm associated with. And although I did not personally do it, I still feel personally responsible. And because of that, they then go into the defense and in a self-protective stance rather than focusing on the reality. They focus on not wanting to hear anymore. Let me just shut it down, close my ears. And that way I don't have to worry about possibly finding out the truth that maybe, there is something about me that enjoys my privilege, or as they would say, white privilege, or my white benefit from historical systems of oppression. Were you going to say something?
No, but I'm going to insert something because I think I've had a lot of thoughts about this. And as a white person who does enjoy some privilege from being white, as a woman, there are other layers that I have to deal with. But typically I do enjoy the privileges of walking in this world as a white person. And I've had to think about that a lot because when I start to feel defensive about things, or when I start to I have learned how to go through some stages of thinking to sort of, I don't even know the term for it, but to step myself
to acknowledge.
To acknowledge, but then also to kind of step myself outside of what I'm used to and what I'm used to seeing and doing, and trying to address and acknowledge, like you said, where are these feelings coming from? It's a lot of work and I do it a lot, but I can see somebody who, like you're talking,
who doesn't want to do the work, right?
Or doesn't even know that that's something that should be acknowledged, or, because it's uncomfortable, like I think you're about to say.
Right. And, for the psychological profiles of those who do support CRT, then those persons are more likely to have less racial guilt. So you may not feel completely guilty you may have a little bit of guilt by recognizing that you are part of a group of race that, has done a lot of bad things in countries or, wherever you've gone, but you don't feel personally responsible for everything that happens. So supporters are more likely to have less racial guilt. They're more likely to have higher individual self-esteem. They are also more likely to be more educated or more intellectually curious, meaning that even if you were to only have a seventh grade education, but you're still curious about what is true and what's not true, then you are more likely to be a supporter than a non-supporter, because you're looking for information for yourself and you're looking for unbiased information just for the sake of curiosity and to just know the truth. And these persons as supporters are also less likely to be intimidated or angry with workforce diversity efforts. So basically, most non-supporters of CRT are persons who are either not wanting to have information because of the psychological discomfort of possibly knowing the truth and possibly having a hand in benefiting from the truth that you don't want to acknowledge, because deep in your heart, you're not racist, but at the same time, you enjoy the racial benefits. And also maybe someone who is just psychologically uncomfortable with confrontation or with not knowing what really will happen if I accept that I have a responsibility as a white person who has benefited from it, to try to do something morally different. So those are just a few of the examples of the psychological profiles of people who do support and who don't support. And we definitely have a lot of information to give for persons to provoke action for what you can do now that you know what critical race theory is, which is a theory to understand how race has been a huge part that's impacting unjustly legal systems, educational systems, and the majority of all systems in America, and what racism is. And you also now are being equipped to know what CRT is not. It's not an attack on all white people. It's not an attack on any one individual white person. It's more of an understanding of how a system has been treating a one group of persons just based off of race. So now that you know that, now you have other actions that you can take and are provoking action now that you are appropriately and unbiasedly informed of what CRT is.
So let's talk about a few of our provoking actions.
Okay. You can go first.
Sure. We can, in our own areas where we live, we can all work to build a system of equity where the community is engaged in the building of that. And I know there's a lot of efforts being done in a lot of places, and citizens can get involved in that in any way that they want to. So that's one thing that you can do. I think one thing as a white person that I've really worked on, doing the work, is to not sweep things under the rug and to actually have conversations, even if they're uncomfortable. So I have friends who are people of color, and if I was feeling myself, like I said before, feeling a little defensive or whatever, I check it and I'm like, okay, what's happening here? And it's uncomfortable, and it's not fun or anything, but like I do appreciate and love my friends, and I want to understand the world better. So
let me just say something. So that's called experiential psychology. So whenever you experience an uncomfortable emotion, your thoughts lead to your emotions, and your emotions lead to your behavior. So if you were having a behavior of defensiveness, then ask yourself, what am I actually thinking, and what are my emotions that are making me defensive? And once you analyze and get down from your behavior to your emotion and then down to your thought, it can then better help you to not understand where you may be feeling attacked or helpless when it comes to conversations about CRT.
Right. And I think a part of doing the work is, so I know that a lot of people talk about being an ally or whatever, but I heard somebody say it's not, I mean, it's great being an ally, but also learn to become an accomplice. So
Oh, I like
yes.
that.
So how can you actually, and this goes back to the first thing I said, how can you actually be a participant
Mm-hmm.
in, and there are lots of ways to be accomplices as white people, so
Mm-hmm.
where can you play these roles that, and I'm not talking about like taking over
Right.
initiatives, or like, because I know that that's a problem too, but I'm saying
Mm-hmm.
like use that white privilege to actually help advance, and promote other people's initiatives, and add to the building of that
Mm-hmm.
community
And to
engagement,
speak up.
and to speak up. Yeah, that's a
Mm-hmm.
difficult but simple one, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
can use your voice.
Mm-hmm.
And also, like, these things don't change overnight. There's a lot of progress happening, but it can be slow. But these small
Mm-hmm.
changes can make huge impacts over time. So if we're
Mm-hmm.
all trying to like talk and think and work these things through, there will be progress, and it will be
Yes.
important to see, for our kids, Dr. Renee.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
speaking of our kids, I think just teaching our children inclusion and empathy from a young age. My family is white, so
Mm-hmm.
not being afraid to talk about it, even
Right.
with
Right.
my child, or um, I want him to feel like this is a normalized situation. Being
Mm-hmm.
inclusive is a normalized thing. I don't
Right.
feel like I grew up like that, because some of the places I grew up in were very much not diverse. So, anyway, I think that we can, as adults, help our children by identifying racism, challenging it, and talking about it.
Right. Excellent. There's actually a landmark study that shows that the more exposure a child has to other racial groups early in life, the more
Uh-huh.
likely they will be to think and act toward those groups in a positive way, and to also be an ally and an advocate for unfair treatment based just on race. There's also another study, if you want to read about it, that just touching, holding hands, having your back against the back of another person of a different race, just that physical contact with another race is more likely to decrease your thoughts of hostility based off of race and also racial insecurities. So
Mm-hmm.
just actual having more actual hands-on time, communication and interaction with other people and other races will definitely help you to, quiet your own discomfort, and also make an announcement to yourself of what really is and what's not true about any racial stereotypes that you might have heard about and are too afraid to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Also, think about it from a sense of indoctrination. If people who are against CRT information, they're also trying to indoctrinate you to not know what the truth is. And so, one example is that in our American history, European Americans almost annihilated all Native Americans,
Mm-hmm.
forcing the survivors into like reservations, stealing their land, and then they're portraying the white people as the heroes and Native Americans as savage villains in American history. So let's change CRT, promoting it in the schools. We're not saying talk about all white people are bad, but let's talk about what really did happen. There are people who really were here, but that land was taken. So focus on just changing the truth by acknowledging what really is the truth in books, in school, and in your conversations at the water cooler.
Mm-hmm.
Also, do not try to become, quote, colorblind, because that's the essence of racism, meaning you're not appreciating, I don't see color. Well, you have to see
Right.
color because that's what we are. And whenever I'm thinking about, the psychology of racism, I think about like the menu for food. When you focus on, I'm hungry, what am I going to have Chinese food today? Will I have Italian? Will I have Thai? Will I have boba tea? Most definitely. So yeah, I'm recognizing differences in a food that I want based off of the difference. So think of that as a menu for our social groups and for our friendships. I want to have more variety. I want to have an abundance and not just the same thing to eat every day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's the same way with race. Focusing on just understanding the truth and having a plethora and variety of information to help us adequately be empowered and informed about what the truth is. And then the last thing, I think the easiest thing I could think of was, in the Bible, they have Esther, and her cousin was telling her, if you don't speak out, don't think that you will be spared. So I encourage all of my other non-Black and brown, listeners and people listening, is to recognize that if you don't speak out and you allow CRT or the truth to not be exposed, don't think that once that system of indoctrination and that system of censoring the truth will not come and affect you when the future happens. So that's just the last thing I wanted to say. I'm glad everyone took the time to still listen all the way to the end of the podcast. And if nothing else, please inform people about what CRT really is, and that it is not an attack on any particular person or groups of people.
And Dr. Renee, I really think we could dig into the psychology of racism a bit more. So I am going to suggest that we talk about that in our next episode. What do you think?
Oh, I think that would be great. Yes, I do that plenty of time for corporations. So I would love to be able to share that with our audience.
And I'd love to, be uncomfortable for a little while too. So. All right. Well, can't wait to talk to you then. And
we are your provocateurs. I'm Dr. Renee.
And I'm Dr. Olysha.
Be informed, be entertained, be provoked.
Well, that would be good. No, I'll take that.
Okay.
I'll be uncomfortable by saying something weird. I'm gonna take that. Bye out. Bye. Oh goodness. Okay.
They're gonna be like, those are such the two nerdiest people.
I'm gonna definitely have some good material to put